Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 167. I'm Igneous, and today we're continuing with the MineOrb construction. The last episode we kind of looked at the beginnings of it, what you see here, this frame that we've laid out. And today I want to get this top exterior dome filled in and mostly complete, as we do with most of our exterior structures. Is they're never really done until we say that the build is done. But in this case, because I've specifically described it as a dome and I've used circles in the layout of that dome, we're putting ourselves in kind of a position where it's very easy to evaluate what we end up with against a specific shape and decide that we either did it right or we did it wrong, which is something that I usually try to avoid. It's a little bit easier to declare decisions made in the name of creativity when you haven't given a specific shape that you're trying to work with. You've given sort of a general shape, and in this case we've been pretty specific, so I wanted to be a little bit careful about how I approach this, and first of all try and get it as close to right as possible the first time through, but also leave it open to reworking it as time goes on. It's not an especially large ship. It's not particularly difficult to rework sections of it, even larger sections, as long as we're open to the idea. If we've convinced ourselves early on that we've completed work on a particular part of the ship, that's when it gets to be a little bit difficult going back and making the decision to change something, because our brains don't always like to hear that when we've already said it's done and we don't have to do any more. That having been said, we're starting pretty easy and taking basically all of the 90-degree points around the circle and covering those over with sort of big plates of hardened steel. It's straightforward. It gives us a good starting point and a good frame of reference. But the important thing here is the framework that I've laid out, and sort of the key to trying to make this work is having those circles. We start at the bottom with a fairly wide circle, relatively speaking, and then as we move up, we continue placing circles, but they get a little bit smaller. And if you were to follow all of those circles and put lines in between them in all the right places, if we did it right, that by itself would lay out the precise shape that we're looking for. When it gets down to actually implementing the overall build, it never works that way, because we don't have that kind of precise control over what we can fill in those gaps with. We have to kind of work with the shapes that we've got. And one of the things that I'm doing here is one way of approaching this, which basically involves looking at the larger sort of plates that we put in place at the 90-degree points around the circle, and then putting some more plates that are a little bit more narrow to either side of those and having them set in about a half a block, which is kind of what we're working on now, is getting everything lined up with that inset. And the end result, it gives the impression that it's starting to bend a little bit around the sphere and making it a little bit closer to what we're going for, kind of this softer transition from one 90-degree point to the other. But ultimately, it's still got some limitations, and looking at it, it still puts us in a position where we have to manage those transitions around the outside. It's starting to become one of those situations where we kind of have to make a decision. We can do it one way or we can do it the other, but we can't do both. So what we've got sort of down that 45-degree point, if we're looking at the circle and we've got those 4 90-degree points taken care of, we do the points in between those, we end up with these really weird shapes, and you know, trying to make them flat as they transition around as best we can, but given the shapes that we have to work with, it's not always possible. So if we look at what we can do with those, and then we look at those little narrow plates that we put in place and try and make everything sort of come together, it doesn't really work. It's just the way the shape kind of merges one with the other. And then looking at saying, okay, well, we've got these narrow plates. How do we make that transition to the 45-degree angle plates that we just put into place? Well, we have to use the 22.5-degree angles, but those don't line up very well with these narrow pieces. So now we've got to come up with something entirely different. And that's what I started doing here, specifically at this point, is trying to make the 22.5 angles line up properly from the 90 points to the 45 points in a way that looks convincing, that fits properly, which ties into making it look convincing, and is also not such a hassle and not so finicky that the idea of duplicating it around the rest of the hull kind of makes me sad. So you can see here, we're basically just making the point of those little 22.5 slopes touch the 45 plates that we put into place, and then extending them back to the 90 plates and sort of whatever shape will fit. And in this case, we end up with almost like a threaded look. Like if you think of like a screw or a bolt, and that spiral down is kind of like what we're getting out of this shape here. And it just struck me as kind of fitting if we're talking about a mining ship. You know, you think like an auger, a mining auger or a mining drill bit or something like that. It's not like we're trying to say that the ship itself is actually spinning itself into the ground, but it does make sense when you look at it on a very superficial level that it might be threaded in some way. Now, ignoring the fact that the threads go alternating backwards and forwards, and of course not being able to explain why the ship itself would be threaded, it's still an aesthetic that I was actually kind of happy with. And even though we're talking about trying to do these transitions and make the dome as convincing as we possibly can, this was one of those things that just sort of jumped out at me and said, you know, I'm happy with this. I would like to keep it, so we just need to keep going and see where it takes us. Get those transitions taken care of as best we can. And once we get a little bit higher up on the dome, we're going to have to come up with a completely different plan, because this is going to stop working. So that was, generally speaking, what was on my mind as I was working my way up. I'm using a lot more of the interior corner blocks that we have. They're specifically 22.5 interior corners, and if you can align them up properly, they can really save a profile. They can save like a particular section of a build by allowing you to connect things together that would otherwise be impossible. You can see up top here, this is kind of where it started to go bad, as I've got all of those 22.5 interior corners lined up, and they kind of they've got like wedges and stuff out of them that you can't, there's no block that matches up properly to, so those specific shapes that we use those blocks to make are imperfect, but they allow us to get through those transitions in a way that's convincing. You can look at it and it makes a little bit more sense than if we had just a bunch of exposed faces or really wonky angles. But I just started to get that sorted out, and look what I do. This here is the exact opposite of what I should have been doing, and it's so disappointing because we made it so far and we were doing so well, and we got the lower section, the transitions I was happy with, and we were kind of working our way up towards the top, and not necessarily perfect, but we were in good shape to just kind of put it in that position where we're like, okay, we're done for now, we're going to leave it, we're going to look at it from time to time, we'll change it as we get other ideas. But this is as far as it got. Yay, look at us, we turned the top into a square instead of the circle that it was supposed to be. I'm actually, to be completely honest, I'm a little disappointed with myself for not catching this as I started to do it, because you can see now I'm using more of those inside and even some of the sneaky outside corners to try and make this transition work from the sloped area to the flat area on the top, and the whole time is just the exact wrong shape on this upper section in order to sell the idea that this is a dome. Normally, when I would do something like this, where I make a gigantic mistake and realize either shortly after I do it when I'm looking at the ship, or as I'm editing or whatever, I would just say, okay, well, that's part of the process that we rework things that aren't working for us. We'll get it in the next episode. But this one was actually a bit too much to leave. I actually had to get in game and rework this whole upper section, almost the entire upper half of the dome. Now this is the the shape that I started off with. Basically what we ended off with for the build section. This is what we had, and I just wanted to get a screenshot of it so they're very, very clear what I was starting with. It's just not very good at all. And then after about an hour of fiddling around and kind of reworking things, trying to get it a little bit closer to something that we would be happy with, this is what I ended up with. It's still not perfect, because it's still a dome in a voxel world, but it's much better up top. It transitions much more smoothly from one circle to the next, so to speak. And then as we get towards the top, it's no longer a square anymore. It's actually fairly convincing round sort of things going on there. There's still room to rework some of it, and I'll probably end up doing that as I go, just sort of behind the scenes, and you'll see the finished result obviously in the reveal of the ship. But for now, I'm pretty happy with the way this has turned out, and it's headed in the right direction, at least I can say. So the next episode, there's a number of things that we can be working on. We have to do the underside of the ship, which is where the drill turrets will be, and they'll be oriented specifically so that they're accessible from inside the ship as well. And then the interior of the ship obviously will be getting a certain amount of attention as well. And this time I want to make sure that the interior is highly functional. Sometimes, like I've said in the past, the interiors I tend to phone in a little bit, just kind of leaving them available for people to do what they want, because I'm sort of, my own personal preferences are a little on the Spartan side. But this time around, I want to make sure that at least between the cockpit and the drill turrets is an easy sort of jaunt. So that's what we have ahead of us, and we'll continue working towards those goals in the next episode. If you want to be notified about that and future episodes, easiest way to do that is to subscribe to me on YouTube or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.